Good evening, everybody. I very warmly welcome you as the acting director of the Cornelia Goethe Center to this very special event. And it's really my pleasure and my honor to open this evening tonight. It is the second lecture of Professor Chandra Mohanty, which she presents in this room, and we are extremely happy that there are as many people as on last Saturday when she gave her first presentation. Not all of you may have been here in 2013 when the guest professorship, the Angela Davis guest professorship, was established, and therefore I will shortly tell you what this guest professorship is about. 2 years ago, Angela Davis came back to Frankfurt for the first time in the 46 years after she had left Frankfurt in 1967. We had invited her and she accepted and inaugurated the chair for International Gender and Diversity Studies in her name at the Cornelia Goethe Center. Angela Davis is a former student of our university. From 1965 to 1967, she was participating in the first actions of the then burgeoning student movement, and she was a PhD student with Horkheimer and Adorno. So she has this link with Frankfurt, and of course, we consider her academic and political work an inspiration for the German academia. With her book, Women, Race and Class, published in 1981, she was the pioneer of Black women's studies, and she preceded the debates on intersectionality, which are important now, an important concept of gender studies. Today, as the second holder of the chair, we welcome another pioneer, and it is no coincidence that she is a friend of Angela Davis. Professor Chandra Mohanty's 1984 article, Under Western Eyes, is a text that is read by most students of gender studies. It belongs to the canon of feminist studies worldwide. It has been translated into more than 20 languages. That text, as much as the work that followed, characterizes Chandra Mohanty as a trailblazer for post-colonial studies, but also for new pathways in transnational feminism. And we are so delighted to have you here. As actually the money for this professorship, for the most part, does not come from the university, but has been raised from outside, I will list the organizations which helped us. The first one is the DK Bank. You can imagine, I mean, look out of the window, so you see the banking buildings, but this bank has supported this chair, which I think is very special. Also, we have been supported by the Cornelia Goethe Center Förderkreis, by the Frankfurt Research Center for Postcolonial Studies, by the Cluster of Excellence Normative Orders, by the Hessische Landeszentrale für politische Bildung, das Hessische Ministerium für Wissenschaft und Kunst, das Frauenbüro der Stadt Frankfurt, the Heinrich Böll Foundation, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and the Freunde and Förderer of the Goethe Universities. Without their generosity, we would not have been able to continue this guest professorship. Before I give the floor to my colleague, Professor Kira Kosnick, who will introduce Professor Mohanty and lead the discussion, I have to give regards to Chandra from Vice President Enrico Schleif, who could not welcome you personally because of his involvement as negotiator with the student assistants who are on strike today. So I think I think if there is a good reason for not being here, then probably that one is one.
Okay. Thank you very much, Helma. My name is Kosnick. I'm a professor of sociology here at Goethe University. And I'm very pleased and honored to introduce tonight Professor Chandra Talpade Mohanty as our Angela Davis Guest Professor for International Gender and Diversity Studies. But before I do so, I would like to take the opportunity to thank a number of people without whom we would actually not be sitting here today. And it's not the banks and it's not the sponsors. This includes, of course, Professor Mohanty herself. But also quite a few people who have done a lot of work behind the scenes to make all of this possible. So first of all, I would like to thank the staff of the Cornelia Goethe Center, most of all, Marianne Schmidbauer, I've seen her, she's right here, Barbara Kowolik, who's over there, and Anna Krämer, who I think is on strike. And they have done so much, everything including finding and balancing budgets. I would also like to thank the members of my team, including Vanessa Thompson and Daya Klingberg, and our Hiwis, our student assistants, Franziska Wesen and Ruben Fernandez, who are on strike today. They protest against the working conditions for student assistants across the university, and I think I would like to express my, and I think I may say our solidarity with their struggle to get union standard contracts. And finally, I would also like to thank a number of additional people who have been very crucial to this whole endeavor, and that is Maria Teresa Herrera Vivar, right here, and Eileen Zaffer, and my colleague Susanne Opfermann, who has also been part of the organizing committee. So, thank you to them all. And now let me turn to our guest of honor and speaker tonight. Chandra Talpade Mohanty was born in Mumbai in India and received her BA and MA degree in English from the University of Delhi. Before she continued her education in the United States, she spent time in Nigeria teaching English at a secondary school. She then attended the University of Illinois, from where she earned a master's degree in education in 1980 and eventually her doctorate degree in 1987. And I'm giving those dates because this means that she wrote her very famous essay, Under Western Eyes, while she was still a PhD student, right? Currently, Professor Mohanty is Distinguished Professor of Women's and Gender Studies and a Dean's Professor of the Humanities at Syracuse University in the US. She is the author, editor, or co-editor of many widely read publications, including the books Feminism Without Borders, Decolonizing Theory, Practicing Solidarity, Third World Women and the Politics of Feminism, also Feminist Genealogies, Colonial Legacies, Democratic Futures, and Feminism and War, Confronting US Imperialism, and finally, the Sage Handbook of on Identities. Her work has been translated into more languages than I am able to mention here, so for those of you who've been here on Saturday, I'd spare us this part. It's lots and lots of languages. She acts as a series editor of comparative feminist studies for Palgrave Macmillan and is also a member of the advisory boards of several journals, including Science, Transformations, Feminist Africa, which is based in South Africa, Asian Women, based in Korea, Feminist Economics, and the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies. She is also the recipient of 2 honorary doctorate degrees, one from the Faculty of Social Sciences at Lund University in Sweden, and more recently an honorary doctorate in humanities from the College of Worcester in Ohio. Chandra Talpade Mohanty is, however, not only an academic, but also very much an activist. She's a steering committee member of the Municipal Services Project, a transnational research and advocacy group focused on alternatives to privatization in the Global South. She's also a founding member of the Democratizing Knowledge Collective at Syracuse University and a coordinating team member of the Future of Minority Studies Research Project. She has worked with 3 grassroots community organizations, namely Grassroots Leadership of North Carolina, the Center for Immigrant Families in New York City, and with Awareness based in Orissa, in India. She was also a member of the Indigenous and Women of Color Solidarity Delegation to Palestine in June 2011. As many of you know, her work focuses on transnational feminist theory, anti-capitalist feminist practices, critiques of globalization, and the politics of knowledge. Central to her academic and political concerns is the transnational project of building a non-colonizing feminist solidarity across borders, and to do so through an intersectional analysis of race, nation, colonialism, sexuality, class, and gender. But beyond analysis, what makes her work additionally interesting and relevant to the Angela Davis Guest Professorship is her concern with anti-racist feminist education and pedagogical strategies more widely. And her talk tonight is entitled Neoliberal Projects, Insurgent Knowledges, and Pedagogies of Dissent. We're extremely honored and happy to have you here, Chandra. Thank you.
Can I turn this off?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Sometimes the phallic props really bother me. Thank you so much, Kira. I am completely delighted to be here and to see so many people in this room. If we were in the US, there'd probably be a bunch of cops coming saying, fire hazard. So half of you leave. Anyway, so I'm not telling you to leave. So really, I've had an amazing time the few days that I've been here. And I want to thank Kira and colleagues at the Cornelia Goethe Center for inviting me as the Angela Davis Guest Professor. I've learned a lot in the few days that I've been here about the urgent issues facing scholar activists at the university and in the city of Frankfurt. I had an amazing meeting with activists on Sunday that taught me a lot. And I've been learning quite a lot, actually, from students in my workshop and people I've been meeting. So today, I want to address the following questions. What does a radical, anti-racist, anti-imperialist feminist engagement consist of in these neoliberal times? What do anti-racist feminist scholars, activists, and cultural workers need to know, analyze, and learn about so we can forge ethical solidarities across material and virtual borders and build the landscapes of racial and gender justice that we dream about and struggle for? What does it mean to craft insurgent knowledges through our writing, our art, our cultural productions, our activism, and our pedagogies? So I want to reflect on some of these questions then as a post-colonial anti-racist feminist located in the imperial belly of the United States. But first, just a little preamble. I want to talk for a couple minutes about the struggles that the students are waging here at Goethe University. So first, a shout out to the student assistants who have been demanding collective bargaining rights and have been striking today for a labor agreement that addresses their precarious contracts and working conditions. Thank you for doing the work. this struggle of precarious university workers is being waged around the world as we witness universities moving towards greater corporatization and neoliberal governance structures. In the US, the success of student activism at NYU, New York University, and the University of Missouri have demonstrated, among a number of others actually in the last few months, have demonstrated the capacity of graduate students organizing for a labor union. In the case of NYU, NYU students got a labor union, and against racism in the instance of the University of Missouri. So in the case of the University of Missouri, students connected with the Black Lives Matter and other anti-racist movements outside the university to successfully call for the resignation of the chancellor and the vice chancellor of the university. So in fact, the two of them resigned. There was a huge media storm, and the platform that the students had was that the people in power positions, in the highest power positions, were paying absolutely no attention to some incredibly racist public instances that were happening on campus. And they were able to mobilize in a way that actually had this impact. Just 2 days ago, in fact, students of color organizing against overt and covert racism at Ithaca College, which is undergraduate college where I live, Ithaca, New York, their organizing led to a mobilization of faculty voting overwhelmingly to pass a no-confidence motion against the college presidents. So again, this is unprecedented. So 86% of the Ithaca College faculty voted a no-confidence motion against the president, which actually means that the Board of Trustees now has to take it seriously, right? So it's not just a few people writing letters or complaining anymore. So here on your own campus, of course, students of color are engaged in a social media campaign this week called #CampusRacism. The campaign, waged on Twitter and Facebook, makes racism in academia visible and shares stories of students of color about racism on German university campuses. Just a very few days here has made it very clear to me, in fact, that racism is alive and well on this campus. Anti-racist struggles are not about a politics of representation, but about the recognition of discriminatory colonial racial legacies and treatment, and the call for justice and transformation of racial hierarchies at multiple levels. This is not a struggle to be waged only by people of color, but one that needs to be embraced by anti-racist white people who see themselves as accountable to the racialized structure of the university. I also want to say that it takes a lot of courage to wage such battles when one is talking about issues that, in fact, are not part of commonsensical discourse in a place. And from what I see, racism is not part of commonsensical knowledge or discourse. In fact, there is a heavy-duty politics of denial in place right now. So it takes courage. But to return to the Student Assistant Initiative, the interplay between needing the labor of graduate students, or student assistants as you call them, as teachers, and insisting they are being awarded for their talent and thus should be grateful for the opportunity instead of making demands, creates an ambiguity that is convenient for the university in terms of maintaining these precarious working conditions. Did you hear what I said? So the contrast between using people as teachers, but then the discourse being that of this is something special you have and you should be grateful for it, means you can, in fact, ignore precarious working conditions because you do not want to define student assistants as labor in any way, right? I know that in the case of this student assistant initiative, the Senate has voted to grant their collective bargaining rights, but that the Presidium refuses to give in, and maybe this meeting that the Vice President did not show up at might actually make some progress there. I hope that those of us here will educate ourselves and support this really important struggle. Sometimes it's easier to support struggles elsewhere than take a stand against injustice in our own front yard. Okay, so that's my preamble. Given my own location now in the United States for 3 decades, Uta, there's a place here you can come sit. Or, yeah, okay. Given my own location in the US for the last 3 decades, I want to offer a brief map of the current landscape of the neoliberal, punitive, militarized, racist, and heteronormative US state and the contours of the neoliberal US academy, and then offer some thoughts or reflections about the cultural working of neoliberal governmentalities. I will then move briefly to the recent urgent anti-racist rebellions in response to police violence that center Black lives and offer an analysis of how these constitute both insurgent knowledges and encode radical pedagogies. And then I conclude with some notes on my own practice in and outside educational institutions. So here are 3 theses about neoliberal states and modes of governmentality. 1, neoliberal states facilitate mobility and cosmopolitanism, that is, travel across borders, for some economically privileged communities at the expense of the criminalization and incarceration, the holding in place of impoverished communities, okay? So they facilitate the travel and mobility of economically privileged communities and hold in place, very often, impoverished communities. The latest anti-racist feminist mobilizations in the US are a perfect example of this growth of a carceral neoliberal state that systematically targets Black and brown bodies. 2, in the US, you forgive me, I will talk a lot about the US, but that's because that is my local space, and that's the space I know well, but I also think that all over the world, people imitate the US at so many different levels that it no longer only holds sometimes for the US. So, number 2, in the US, neoliberal discursive landscapes are characterized by the privatization of the social justice commitments of post-1960s radical social movements and the insurgent knowledges that the movements led to, okay? I'm talking about then the fact that through the 60s, the mobilization of various marginal communities, right, led to the forming of and the demand in universities for certain kinds of knowledges to be institutionalized or at least to be taught, right? But the landscape we're talking about now is characterized by the privatization of those commitments. Privatizing commitments to race, class, and gender justice means removing the social significance of racism, classism, or heterosexism as institutionalized systems of power and inequality from the public domain, removing them and substituting individual prejudice and psychological dispositions of hate instead. And if you think about how media tends to talk about instances of discrimination, you'll see what I mean. So you remove an understanding which is social and structural from the public domain, and you substitute in. So when there are instances of racism, it is always one individual person who has done something, okay? Or one person who should know better did something. 3, The other side of this privatization and retrenchment of social justice commitments is the formation of the national security state. And in my first lecture, I talked at some length about this. National security states or securitized regimes typically use connected strategies of militarization, criminalization, and incarceration to exercise control over particular populations, remaking individual subjectivities and public cultures. So, particular racialized bodies are subjected to militarized violence anchored in the production of reactionary gender identities and dominant and subordinate, often racialized masculinities. I think that right now in Europe and also in the US, you could think about the rise of Islamophobia and the targeting of Muslim bodies, of whatever colors, as a good example of what kinds of discourses are being produced, how policing happens, and how reactionary gender identities are being produced. So within right-wing movements, which are on the rise in Germany and elsewhere, I like this notion of reactionary gender identities, okay? Because what that draws attention to is particular kinds of masculinities and femininities or womanhood that are being produced, usually normed on a heterosexual scale, okay? So my definition of transnational feminist praxis is anchored in very particular intellectual and political genealogies. In studies of race, colonialism, and empire in the global north, in the critiques of feminists of color in the US, and in studies of decolonization, anti-capitalist critique, and LGBTQ queer studies in the north and the south. My use of this category is thus anchored in my own location in the global north and in the commitment to work systematically and overtly against racialized, heterosexist, imperial corporatist project that characterize North American global adventures. My interest in the connections between the politics of knowledge and the spaces, places, and locations that my interest lies in the connections between the politics of knowledge and the spaces, places, and locations that we occupy. I have worked for over 2 decades with my colleague Jackie Alexander, thinking through the political and epistemological struggles that are embedded in radical transnational feminist praxis at this time. So I'm drawing now on some of this work, and I want to focus specifically on mapping location and power in the US Academy. One of the major points of our analysis is to understand the relationship between a politics of location and accountability and the politics of knowledge production. And we both do this by examining the academy as one site in which transnational feminist knowledge is produced. We also examine those knowledges that derive from political mobilizations that push up in and against the academy, ultimately foregrounding the existence of multiple genealogies of radical transnational feminist practice. And this then, I think, is an example of neoliberal projects and insurgent knowledges. In other words, the example being the way transnational feminist studies or the deployment of the term transnational or even international, which might be the more current term here, is used or institutionalized within the academy, and how that influences how the idea of transnational feminist praxis, and how that ideas or those ideas get troubled by looking at transnational feminist praxis as it exists in movements and organizations and advocacies outside the institution, but that push up against the institution. And so part of what we're trying to do is to talk about how there isn't one genealogy. It isn't actually a university that creates necessarily the way one thinks about radical transnational feminist praxis. And as you know, anytime a term or a concept becomes current, given the neoliberal space we live in, there is always a danger of it being co-opted and it being made into an industry. which is, in fact, what I think has happened with intersectionality in many ways, okay, in the EU and also at institutional levels. Okay. The US Academy is a very particular location for the production of knowledge. Within a hegemonic culture of conformity and surveillance, many of us experience the perils of being in the US Academy. At a time when women's and gender studies, race and ethnic studies, queer studies, and critical area studies run the risk of co-optation within the neoliberal, multiculturalist, corporatist frame of the academy, we bear a deep responsibility to think carefully and ethically about our place in this academy where we are paid to produce knowledge and where we have come to know that the spatiality of power needs to be made visible and to be challenged. So one of the questions that Jackie Alexander and I raised then is whether it is possible to undo the convergence between location and knowledge production. The convergence between location and knowledge production. Put differently, can transnational feminist lenses push us to ask questions that are location-specific, but not necessarily location-bound? Okay, location-specific, but not location-bound, so that we are then asking questions which do not only apply to narrowly understood questions of identity or community, but that we are asking questions from within particular communities that are able to explain features of the social world which are not bound by that location. Okay? If we take seriously the mandate to do collaborative work in and outside the academy, the kind of work that would demystify the borders between inside and outside, and thereby render them porous rather than mythically fixed, it is imperative that the academy not be the only location that determines our research and pedagogical work. That we recognize those hierarchies of place where multiple sites and locations the hierarchies of place within multiple sites and locations in which knowledge is produced, and we maintain clarity about the origin of the production of knowledge and the spaces where the knowledge travels. This mandate, in turn, requires the recognition that knowledge is produced by activist and community-based political work, that some knowledges can only emerge within these contexts and locations. I think this is an important point, that there are particular knowledges that can only emerge through certain kinds of political activist engagements. Thus, in not understanding the intricate and complex links between the politics of location, the geographies and spatialities of power, and the politics of knowledge production, we risk masking the limits of the work we do within the academy, and more specifically, their effects on the kinds of pedagogic projects we are able to undertake in the classroom. So in other words, if we don't recognize that the spatialities of power and the politics of knowledge production as being truncated if all we do is stay within the boundaries of the academy, then we risk we essentially truncate the kinds of pedagogic projects that we are able, and activist projects we are able to undertake. So I want to then deliberately draw on knowledges and critiques generated from multiple sites, intellectual, scholarly, community organizing, and social movements. If we take the connection between the politics of location and politics of knowledge seriously, we must be attentive to the stories our citations tell. Some knowledges can perhaps be best cultivated within movements for justice. In the context of this landscape, what constitutes insurgent knowledge? I think, alongside a number of scholars and activists, that the economic process of privatization and the attendant ideologies of social entrepreneurship, efficiency, and the logic of the market as progress is the glue that cements these imperial state projects. It is privatization that has led to a, quote, silent revolution. This process of corporatizing and emptying the public spaces of democratic life and governance, of abdicating all accountability to citizens. And for me, making visible and analyzing, for instance, the privatization of war, of prisons, and of higher education is the practice of generating potentially insurgent knowledge. So both the choice of what to examine, that is the site that one studies or works with, and what information to use in this analysis, the politics of citation, are important here. Who one draws on, what knowledges you draw on in order to conduct the kind of knowledge production or research that you're engaged in are really crucial, right? So if your citations remain, for instance, within a traditional understanding of the Frankfurt school, for instance, however fantastic they were and are, right? There are certain questions that you will never be able to address, and there are ways that the knowledges that are produced will be truncated, okay? So that's what I mean by a politics of citation. So I suggest that we treat privatization in the same way as we treat racialization or sexualization or colonialism, as a process that is fundamentally about the creation of debilitating hierarchies of rule, a process that is of great significance to our everyday lives. Privatization is the explicit form, economic and political globalization, what we also refer to now as neoliberal practices, takes in the US. I think it exists elsewhere and definitely in Europe. In the US, privatization is the flip side of the structural adjustment programs that developing countries were subjected to by the IMF and World Bank since the 1980s. Privatization disproportionately impacts working women and people of color, just as structural adjustment projects in developing countries disproportionately impact women and poor people. So this is one arena where US and European feminists, I think, have learned a lot from their third world feminist sisters, who have been doing this work for much longer than many of us in the West have. I work with a grassroots organization that Kira mentioned that has been in a campaign for almost 2 decades to abolish all for-profit prisons, jails, and detention centers. There were no private prisons in the US until 1983. Between 1984 and 2005, the number of people incarcerated in private prisons, jails, and detention centers, which is the latest incarnation of private prisons, and the incarnation is of immigrant detention centers at the US-Mexico borders, right? And so the number of people went from none to over 120,000. The majority of people in private prisons are in the 11 states of the old Confederacy, meaning the American South. The South's history of racialized incarceration and the convict leasing system and chain gangs tends to make prison privatization more familiar and more acceptable, okay? So it's no wonder that education, not incarceration, is a slogan used by anti-private prison activists and prison abolitionists. So for me, the critique of privatization is the space of insurgent knowledge because it makes local and global links visible and allows me to engage a transnational, anti-racist and anti-capitalist feminist critique. It links scholarship and the production of knowledge with some of the most significant struggles and social movements on the ground, and it is a context where I cannot ignore my own accountability. Anti-war, prison abolitionist, and anti-capitalist progressive education movements are connected to the way privatization and corporate control works in each of these arenas of US wars, the prison industrial complex, and the corporate university. This is a place to build solidarity based on concrete analyses of power and issues of social and economic justice anchored in the recognition of gender, race, and national legacies and modes of resistance. You doing okay? You with me so far? Okay. Let's now consider the anti-violence and political mobilizations to abolish prisons that dovetail with anti-globalization and anti-militarization campaigns. Activists in these global networks have examined how punishment regimes, including the prison, are intimately linked to global capitalism, neoliberal politics, and US economic and military dominance. More specifically, however, it is the incarceration of increasing numbers of impoverished women of color that enables us to track the links between neoliberal privatization, the US export of prison technologies, organized militarization, dominant and subordinate patriarchies, and neo-colonial ideologies. I'm going to redo that. The links between neoliberal privatization, US export of prison technologies, organized militarization, dominant and subordinate patriarchies, and neo-colonial ideologies. As Julia Sudbury argues, women's, quote, women's testimonies of survival under neoliberal cutbacks, border crossing, exploitation in the sex and drug industries, and life under occupation and colonial regimes provide a map of the local and global factors that generate prison as a solution to the conflicts and social problems generated by the New World Order, unquote. One of those social problems is the massive migration of impoverished women and men from the global south, instigated by neoliberal globalization, who are now disproportionately criminalized, together with indigenous and aboriginal women from Canada and the United States to Australia. Sudbury's collection, Global Lockdown, which was published in 2005, is significant for thinking through these relationships refracted through the transnational spatialization of power for several reasons. First, it is located within critical anti-prison and anti-violence projects such as Critical Resistance, the Prison Activist Resource Center, the Arizona Prison Moratorium Coalition, and social justice. Second, the contributors to the collection, in Sudbury's words, are, quote, intellectuals, both organic and intellectual, former prisoners, political prisoners, activists, women in recovery, former sex workers, immigrants, and indigenous women, unquote, who by virtue of their differentiated locations point to the gaps that ensue when political struggle is not attentive to connectivity. Okay, did you get what I was saying? Okay. Or some people are nodding. Is everybody nodding or not? Okay. Third, to take seriously the insights of differently positioned intellectuals is not to argue that prison intellectuals or sex workers have knowledge too. It is to say, rather, that their location engenders an epistemic advantage which researchers not similarly positioned have been unable to mobilize. Okay? It helps us explain why scholars have yet to locate, or many scholars have yet to locate, I think a lot of people are doing this now, to locate race, citizenship, and national status at the center of the prison boom. Okay? And fourth, it enacts different border crossings of geography and the nation state, of time and the continued, although continuous traffic between the colonial, the neo-colonial, and the imperial, among and between different colonized spaces of different yet related political mobilizations, at the center of whose praxis is the labor of building connectivity not only to upset the cartographic rules that would position the prison and the brothel as separate and unrelated spaces, and the women within them only as objects of scholarly study and state rehabilitation, but to redraw and therefore reiterate through practice the connectivity of those spaces and ultimately of the political struggles that make that connectivity possible. That was an incredibly long sentence. I apologize for that. Sometimes this is what happens when you write something and you're just like, and you haven't read it aloud to yourself. Okay. Many decades ago, John Dewey wrote that, quote, Democracy is a way of life that has to be made and remade by each generation, unquote. Democracy is being made and remade in our names all over the world. And we need to use all the analytical, social, and political skills we can marshal as members of communities with access to knowledge and critical research and pedagogical tools. This means asking the question, what constitutes insurgent knowledge at this time in history? In other words, always asking, I think, if one wants to produce knowledge in the service of economic and social justice, then there is always this question to be asked. How is the knowledge I am producing either reproducing the status quo or working against the status quo and to benefit the communities alongside who I want to struggle? Okay, not for whom I want to speak, but alongside who I want to struggle. So I want to move now to some reflections on the most recent anti-racist insurgencies against the securitized racist US police state. Rather than thinking about these insurgencies as riots, which is how they were labeled, I'm talking about the last year and a half, understanding the continuities between slavery and the current racist violence that targets Black and brown people in the US, and labeling the insurgencies as rebellions is a form of decolonizing knowledge. The violence towards African Americans has a too long history. Zila Eisenstein, a political theorist, Zila Eisenstein argues that the newest new of racism replaces homogeneity with complexity and fluidity, and the modernization of the slave relation itself. So in other words, racism has, the way it is visible now, has continuities with slavery, has continuities with the way racism emerged at various other historical moments, but there has also been a sort of complexification and a fluidity that requires looking more carefully. Black slavery was an ultimate form of dehumanization and severing of people from their histories, memories, and their sense of place. Although racism is no longer articulated in a system of chattel slavery, it is enforced through a prison police state of carceral punishment that bears an uncanny similarity to the slave system. The new slavery, or the newest new racism, demands a more complex resistance because the problem is complex. Misogyny still masquerades within the anti-racist rhetoric. Rekia Boyd, Natasha McKenna, Tanisha Anderson, Sandra Bland are Black women who have died at the hands of police or in prison. Yet, there are no marches in their name. 20% of unarmed Blacks killed in the last 15 years by police are Black women. And I don't know how many of you have kept up with the news, but the most recent, completely scandalous thing is the trial of a white police officer who raped 13 Black women in Oklahoma, who have finally come forward, but there is very limited media coverage. I mean, which other group, if there were 13 women who were raped by a single person and a cop, would this not hit the media in a huge way, right? So if for people who are interested in this work, I would recommend going to the African American Policy Forum, which has been working, which has created a campaign called #SayHerName, and which is, it's Kimberly Crenshaw's gig, and what they do is literally do a lot of research, create policy documents and reports, and mobilize around the particularities of the violence that Black women face in the US. Sexual violence and rape are the more usual forms of racist treatment of Black and brown women. Marissa Alexander was jailed for defending herself against an abusive husband, as are countless women in domestic abuse situations. The new resistance and organized movements of black men and women are more inclusive and radical than the earlier landscapes in the 1960s and 70s civil rights movement. In other words, they're much less masculinist, although I have to say they remain masculinist and patriarchal. So that has not disappeared. This may in part be because racism itself has become more exposed in its complex forms. The leadership of Black Lives Matter, Million Hoodies, Hands Up United, Black Youth Project 100, Dream Defenders, etc., is staffed with people of all genders and sexual orientation. And in fact, as you know, the leadership of Black Lives Matter is black queer women. Black women's lives have been silenced when chattel slavery is described singularly as a racist system, rather than as intimately sexual as well. So this, I think, is again important. So when we start talking about anti-racist work, right, we need to trace the genealogies of anti-racist work also in terms of their sexualized, gendered, and class intersections. Because chattel slavery actually does not make sense unless you pay attention to gender and sexuality. Okay. So chattel slavery was a racial and sexual system of exploitation, brutalization, and oppression. Slavery today remains implicated in both racism and misogyny. Its intimate intersectional relationship continues through more present forms. Our job then is to create insurgent anti-racist feminist knowledges. Insurgent knowledges are knowledges that demystify the circuits of power and draw on historical legacies of resistance to create spaces where democratic, anti-colonial, non-hierarchical, non-exploitative relationships, identities, and communities can be imagined and practiced. Sometimes I am putting a lot of words together. It might be difficult to listen to, but if I don't put those words together, I actually am missing some really key analytical and historical counters in making that argument. That's why it's important to say, right, non-hierarchical, anti-colonial, non-exploitative, etc. Insurgent knowledges are not merely alternative knowledges. They are knowledges that contest dominant paradigms and habits of being, okay? So they're not just alternative. It would be too easy if all we did in women and gender studies or race and ethnic studies was multiply the knowledges that are being produced. You know, then we would be very comfortable in the academy, but we're not very comfortable, or some of us, excuse me. A number of people are comfortable. Some of us are not comfortable in the academy because the object is, in fact, to produce knowledges that contest dominant paradigms, not just offer alternatives. They are knowledges that do not suffer from a paucity of the imagination, but can enable the conditions for social and economic justice on the widest possible scale. Insurgent knowledges must contest the normative, individualist, free market-oriented paradigm of the consumer citizen and make possible a collective, justice-based, differentiated understanding of citizenship across national, racial, and gender divides. I learned early on that certain ways of thinking and analyzing were dangerous. They posed not just intellectual or theoretical threats, but they translated into everyday interactions and relationships at my place of work. After all, the colonial racialized discourses I was writing about were often inscribed on my own body. And it is this deep and inevitable connection between the knowledges I produce, the collectivities they are inspired by and anchored in, and the embodiment in my own everyday life and identity that has been most instructive for me in the US Academy. So in other words, if I did not reflect on why the knowledges or the questions I was asking, the kinds of ideas I wanted to teach about, the kinds of research I wanted to do, how all of these things were connected to my own genealogy and history, and who I was embodied as an embodied person in the academy, I think I would not be able to make sense of why these knowledges actually are dangerous. Okay? Because then they would just become alternatives. Fundamentally then, I'm talking about breaking the epistemological contract, which is Sylvia Wynter's term, that consigns the hierarchy of space and positions only those at the top as capable of producing and disseminating that knowledge. And breaking that epistemological contract would necessarily entail divesting academic identities from the will to power, moving beyond a liberal, policy-neutral academic stance to actively developing a radical ethic that challenges power and global hegemonies. So, to conclude, let me return to insurgent knowledges and radical politics, or pedagogies. To me, this means always asking ethical questions about what it means to be a feminist scholar, teacher, and organizer in the belly of the beast. To use the skills and commitments I have to draw maps of the world that we live in that expose the way power and exploitation work, to hold myself accountable to the marginalized communities I work in solidarity with, not just to my academic communities, to hold myself accountable to the marginalized communities I work in solidarity with, not just to my academic communities. And this is risky business. To envision and enact a project of social and economic justice that is committed to the emancipation of all colonized peoples, and to simply continue to do this work. I always remember Audre Lorde saying, you know, I am a Black, lesbian, warrior, feminist, just doing my work. And I often think that for some people, just doing their work is an amazing thing because of the courage it takes, because of the kinds of visions they are able to mobilize. I'm engaged in an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist feminist project anchored in the work, lived experience, and theory of transnational feminists of color and community and social movement activists. I agree with Angela Davis when she says that while a Black man as president, Obama, does not erase legacies of racism, colonialism, and economic domination, it does mean that we can inhabit our histories differently. Okay? So let me end then by talking about some pedagogical imperatives and epistemic strategies we can deploy in our classrooms and our everyday journeys through academic spaces. 1, connect the academy and university to national and transnational institutions of rule and oppositional social movements. That is, talk about the corporate, prison, cyber, military, industrial complex. So in my context, Syracuse University, there are some incredibly straightforward examples of how this functions within the university. We have a graduate program called National Security Studies. We have funding from the National Institute for the Humanities for research on anti-terrorism, military technology, etc. We have a research group now that has enormous funding that is actually trying to, quote, predict where the next terrorist attacks will take place. So, and you can imagine what that means. To predict them, it means creating profiling, various forms of profiling. Okay, anyway, you know that. So connect the university, national and transnational institution of rule and oppositional social movements. 2, Make power hierarchies, labor relations, knowledge and disciplinary hierarchies, research funding, financial aid priorities, and so on, transparent. And connect these to questions of social control and collective struggles outside the academy. So for instance, in my situation, we often, those people I work with will often talk about how the university engages subcontracting services, okay? How the university legitimates a Eurocentric curriculum, how part-time faculty or casualized faculty labor is used, questions of unionization, of people of color faculty, staff, and student support structures, or the lack thereof, undocumented student admissions, etc. Okay? 3, engage in institutional ethnographies that historicize and contextualize questions of difference in institutional and curricular terms, and issue state of the university reports. Form watchdog groups to monitor corporate practices, investment portfolios, etc. Call for divestment. Okay? 4, actively resist privatization of social justice movements, or commitments, sorry, not movements. Ask what public means in the rhetoric that is mobilized in a university. How citizenship, democracy, and justice are addressed by university mandates. Make universities accountable to the public good defined in social justice and redistribution of resources terms, not the politics of presence or charitable acts towards communities. Okay? Politics of presence is basically a multiculturalist diversity management perspective, which believes, or which is predicated on the idea that all we need is more black and brown bodies in order to address questions of racism and inequality, right? And that, you know, that really, it doesn't work like that at all. So we have a lot of women in our universities. Does that make our universities feminist? Okay, no. So it's not about that. So, and in my context, there is a lot of discourse these days about community involvement, engaged scholarship, global citizenship, and so on. I don't know what the corresponding terms are here for you all, these are the categories that are mobilized within the university that sometimes can be radical work and sometimes, in fact, is a way of managing the kind of demands that are being put on the university to do a lot more social justice-oriented thinking, research, and pedagogy. Finally, make market logic and national security priorities of universities and the state transparent in the curriculum. Create and build collectivities of dissent, study groups, watchdog groups, unions, mentoring collectives that nurture the will to critique and dissent. Basically, organize in the academy. There's no way to change a whole lot of stuff in the academy unless we organize. So I'm going to end with a quote from Black feminist scholar, activist, and writer Toni Cade Bambara that encapsulates the spirit of Insurgent Knowledges and Pedagogies of Dissent for me. And here's the quote. Stories are important. They keep us alive in the ships, in the camps, in the quarters, field, prisons, on the road, on the run, underground, under siege, in the throes, on the verge. The storyteller snatches us back from the edge to her next chapter, in which we are the subjects, we, the hero of our tales, our lives preserved, how it was, how it be, passing it along in the relay. This is what I work to do, to produce stories that save our lives. End of quote. Thank you so much for listening.
do, and I hope that these microphones are turned off. Yes, they're now being turned on. So you can keep this one, and I'm going to hand these over to Vanessa and Dasha, who have... Oh, you have your own. Fantastic. Right. We didn't have that much time on Saturday for discussion, so let's jump right into it. Please feel free to voice your questions and comments, please.
Okay, don't all speak at once.
Let's give them a second. And I'd also like to encourage the students here who I know have been discussing your work quite intensively, not just since Saturday, but also for the past weeks and months. I'd like to encourage you to speak up, because this is really a lecture for you and not for the professors among us. So please feel invited to. I mean, obviously also for the professors invited. I don't want to shut them up, but you know how it goes usually, you know. So please feel free to say something here. If not, I'm going to start with a question, again, the professor, but I'm hoping to articulate something that we've talked about when we discussed your work in class, and it was a concern of the students who also wondered how is it that we can actually start seeing the university as not just a place of acquiring knowledge, but in fact of engagement, and how can we engage with the university and people at the university, and particularly the difficult question of how do we build alliances around particular issues and not just sort of work on our own concerns. And so in a way it sort of comes back to the question that you raised also on Saturday, the point about sort of the common differences. And maybe you could say a bit more on what your experience is of what you would suggest in terms of student groups trying to work together, but also maybe go beyond the student level as such and organize around different issues. What are sort of the chances and also pitfalls of trying to build coalitions?
Yeah. Okay. So let me talk very specifically from my experience at Syracuse University. In the last year, we have had a very large mobilization, student mobilization, that is feminist, multiracial, queer, interested in labor issues, you name it. People who are part of disability rights movements, etc. Now, they call themselves, and I thought this was kind of brilliant, they call themselves the general body. Okay, and I thought it was brilliant because it's a way of saying we are not marginal. We are the general body of this university. And here are the things. You want a translation of the general body? No. What they did is they came together, and you see, in our institution, we have had a shift of leadership over the last 2 years, and from a very progressive leadership to an incredibly corporatized and conservative leadership. And a lot of policies are being changed. So in other words, it is not that hard to create common cause, because it is literally all of the marginalized constituencies that are being targeted at the same time. So the first act that the administration did was over the summer when no one is around, which is always when universities act, if you've noticed. They, in fact, closed down the sexual assault center. Okay, this was the center that had been there for a very long time. It was a community-based, university-based center which had been created Sexual Assault and Harassment, I forget what it's called, something like that, center. And it has been key to student life at the university. They basically shut it down and said that what they were going to do was move the services of the center into the mental health services. Okay? So, I mean, so there was huge mobilization around that, and, thousands of people actually signed petitions, etc. That was one. The next thing they did was they said that they were not going to continue something called the POSSE program. The POSSE program is a program for black and brown students who are from working class urban backgrounds and who are funded to come in a group to the institution and have a whole series of resources available for them, mentoring, etc. So it's a way of trying to make sure that marginalized students don't feel isolated, but actually succeed in a white institution, right? So that program has been actually very important to students of color. Well, administration, no more. So there was huge organizing around that, right? So it went. The graduate students, they changed the health care policy for graduate students and teaching assistants, right? So then they could no longer afford on their salaries the health care that they needed. So this is just an example of how there were many levels at which the administration acted. Now, it's possible that if these students, the general body, had not come together to do some real investigative work about exactly what are the policies that have been put in place and which are the constituencies that have been affected by it, they would not have been able to build the coalition that they built. So I guess one lesson from that in terms of building coalition is actually to do research and homework about exactly what is in place, what constituencies are being affected, and then figure out what kinds of common interests are possible. So the general body mobilized, they took over the administration building, they were there for like 3 weeks, they lived there, and faculty, who's very progressive, but sometimes does not want to take any risk, suddenly got protective of students. So they were like, we can't let our students face this on their own. That was sort of interesting because for me, that's what mobilized faculty, but who cares? They were mobilized, right? So there was a huge mobilization of progressive and left faculty for the first time in a long time that I've seen in support of the general body. So long and short of it is that they were able to come up with a list of demands around policies that affected all of the constituencies that were part of the coalition. Was the coalition easy? No. Did they yell and scream at each other? Yes. Did they leave the place in tears? Yes. But did they stay together? Yes. So what was interesting was the organizing that happened because they were able to think about the university in larger terms than just a place where they get their degrees or a place which has bad policies on sexual assault, for instance. I mean, for instance, the fact that they moved the center, the work of the center, which was obviously, and then, there are all these questions of confidentiality and all, all of that stuff is problematic, right? What was clear was that none of there was a whole bunch of international students who would never go to the mental health center if they were assaulted because it was a stigma to be going somewhere to say, I need that kind of, so it was completely clear that this was not, so that then mobilized the international students who were not necessarily within feminist circles. So all I'm saying is there's a way in which one crafts this, but it is slow going, and one has to do one's research and not assume that there are, automatic coalitions. I think when we fail, it's when we assume that people of color, feminists, labor activists, etc., all have to be, holding hands. And that doesn't work because people, a lot of this is about political education. So a lot of the work that the general body did was on political education. And they had many of us come in and do workshops on a whole bunch of different things, right? On different topics. So the education continued while the occupation continued, and they actually managed to get the administration to back off in a number of different things. We didn't get the center back. We're still fighting for that one. So.
I know you're dying to say something.
Oh, good, somebody.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. Like, I'm also taking part in the student struggle today, and I'm also like part of the organized students at our Institute for Political and Social Science. And so we have like kind of similar fights. Just on Monday, we were also like asking the question about like, is there a need for a council for women at our institute? Because obviously our institute, as you said, like has a lot of women in it, but the question still is it feminist therefore? And I would of course also say obviously not. And so we had that big fight, but it always, there was like the main argument of the people who were not supporting the Council of Women was like money, of course. So yeah, I think the crucial question that you also touched in the end is like, how can you come like from only defending a status quo that is of course better than becoming even more neoliberal to having more like active or progressive parts of your struggles as well. So maybe you can elaborate a little more whether you can, I don't know, like kind of institutionalize some of the education work you did there, or how you can also get like more independent spaces maybe, yeah, over that more or less only fighting back the repression you get all the time. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that's true, that part of the reason why it is hard to change institutions from the inside is that institutions know how to immediately recalibrate and shift, right? Just like global capital, you just move. So therefore, the struggles can't be just struggles that are waged only on the inside. So with the general body, we had a lot of the leadership was doing work with migrant seasonal workers, undocumented workers in the city, with environmental justice movements, with workers' movements in the city, so that they were able to make connections between what it is that the university did, right, in the city itself, and how that could mobilize larger constituencies. So one idea is to, and that's part of what I was talking about in the spatialization thing, is to not assume that the space of the university is a discrete space and that it has to be fought within within its own terms. It's very hard to fight power within its own terms. Yeah? So there's got to be a way of stepping outside and mobilizing outside in order to put pressure, whether that is social media, whether that is popular media, or artwork, an art installation, whatever. There's a lot of different levels at which one can do work to put pressure and not be completely contained by the university. So for instance, this project I'm involved in, the Democratizing Knowledge Collective, it's many of us who are faculty and some graduate students from across the institution. And while our project was funded by soft money from the previous chancellor, the moment the new chancellor came, we had no money. So we had to go out and get money from like the Mellon Foundation. Now we were lucky that we were able to get some funding, and we now have this summer institute, which is, I mentioned this at the activist meeting, it's called Just Academic Spaces, Creating New Publics with Radical Literacies. And it's a 3-year institute. The first will be held at Syracuse, the second at Rutgers University, Newark. Syracuse is a private institution. Rutgers, Newark is a public institution which has no racial ethnic majority, which is completely unique. It has none. Okay, so there's no one group that is dominant. And Newark, I don't know if anybody knows what Newark is like, but the city of Newark is kind of phenomenal in terms of immigrant and people of color domination and lives. And then the third is Spelman College, which is a historically black women's college. So we're doing the same institute in 3 places, right, as a way to mobilize different constituencies, but to also see what translates. And it's an institute which involves community organizations.
Okay, hello. I'm part of the #CampusRacism crew, and what we discuss in our group is that we don't really have here at the university institution or a place where we can go to when we experience, as people of color, racism experiences, and also connected to sexism and like as women of color here at the university. And I wonder if you maybe could talk about the institutions that you have at Syracuse, and if maybe this is also like the anti-discrimination institutions, if this is a result of protest, or yeah, how your experiences are at your university.
Yeah. So yes, a lot of US colleges and universities have what they call multicultural centers, student centers, or organized. They are, I think that they were first established because of pressure from students, but I think they have since become kind of cultural spaces, which, so one of the missions is to, we have Black History Month, we have Latino History Month, we have some other history month. So this organization or this office organizes events for those periods, right? But it also has mentoring, counseling, and other kinds of services available. Now, do I think that it's a place that you can organize through? No. So, my experience is that it is, and this is maybe something that faculty here could be thinking about, which is that my experience is that faculty need to build a critical mass in terms of the work around these kinds of issues, and that faculty need to figure out a way that mentoring relationships can be built. Some of this requires you actually hire people of color on the faculty. No, seriously, right? But I think that actually, many of our students, or my students, my colleagues' students, were involved in the general body, And it was interesting. I was teaching feminist theory class. They would come to class. They'd say, okay. We need to share this. This is what happened today. And then we'd be reading all this stuff, and they'd go there, and then they'd tell everybody else who was not in class, okay, here, you have to pay attention to this. This is how we think about this. This is how we organize this. So in other words, there was more fluidity between the classroom and the organizing space. And I think that was most useful. In terms of having support, all you can do is to make the demand visible and hold people who are your allies accountable for that, I think. No?
First of all, thank you very, very much for your solidarity for all our struggles here. I was very intrigued by what you call the undoing of the convergence of location and the production of knowledge, and how or a project of building a sort of location-specific but not location-bound
yes.
form of knowledge. And I was wondering how that is connected to your concept of epistemic privilege, how maybe alternative kinds of knowledge production like storytelling, like we talked about in the workshop, how that sort of fits in there. And then also, how does it connect to the intersectionality of struggles or what you call coalition building? Mm-hmm. Is that what is needed for certain kinds of coalition building?
Right. So you just want to ask 4 difficult questions all in one breath. Yeah, I'm not sure I'll remember all those 4 things, but okay, so let me start with, okay, Fina, remind me, first thing you said. You see, you forgot to, yeah. Oh, location specific and location bound, and how that connects to epistemic privilege. Aha, okay. So, the way it connects to, first of all, epistemic privilege, right? Epistemic privilege, as the way we talked about it, was not that just because one happens to be in a marginalized, oppressed position, you have privileged knowledge. That's not what epistemic privilege is. And it isn't privileged knowledge about the entire world or everything that happens in the world. So epistemic privilege is completely connected to the kind of interpretive frame that can be mobilized from particular marginalized locations to read the way power functions in the world. And so you could have epistemic privilege given your location, your experience, and your critical thinking about it. You could have epistemic privilege in understanding some particular feature of the social world, right? So in terms of this idea of location-specific versus location-bound, location-specific is a way of saying we need to pay attention to the multiple contexts and layers of histories, memories, cultural artifacts, everything, right? The sort of thick narrative of a context in which we are trying to figure out something, right? But if we do that and we claim that this is only relevant to that particular context or place, we will be reducing exactly what kind of knowledge can be produced in that context. So, so the reason it should be location-specific and not, and frankly, you know, I don't know how one does this completely, but that's what we would like to be able to do, because we'd like to be able to do some comparative thinking and some comparative organizing around experiences and movements and so on, right? So it's about figuring out what kinds of strategies, ways of thinking, visions can emerge from doing a location-specific analysis and not claiming that this only works in this context. And usually, if you know, nobody who is part of a hegemonic knowledge structure ever makes that claim, because the point is that there is no location for this. We are omniscient and we can produce knowledge that is applicable to everybody. No? So if you start from there, you don't ever have to locate yourself, right? So but then if you then want to specify and you leave it at this is only relevant for a small number of working class urban people engaged in housing struggles, right? Rather than from this particular group of people involved in struggles around housing, we learn these and these kinds of principles for how to think about the urban landscape, how to think about the way housing structures, housing policies work in Frankfurt or wherever, and then use that to figure out where it works and where it doesn't, right? So it's a way of mobilizing, I think, analysis and making it clear that marginalized spaces really can provide, it's like what I said before, there's some knowledges that are only possible within social movements, and they're not, you cannot sit in a room and theorize it. You can theorize what the implications are. You can theorize what the impact could be or something, but you can't actually come up with those concrete knowledges. So I don't know if I don't quite know how to connect location-specific and bound to epistemic privilege, and I don't know that it necessarily connects. What's your second question? Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah. So the forms of the form of knowledge production, right, also needs to shift. So if all we do is write and produce theory, which sounds which is in a certain voice, no, then it stands to reason that you're going to leave out huge numbers of people, and you're always going to leave out histories that are marginal and the multiple histories that exist most of the time in the situation that you're looking for. So when we read some of these texts, people used in very complex and compelling ways storytelling, collective, collaborative storytelling as a form of creating knowledge, but also connecting across various differences. Because stories actually allow people to hear each other in ways that a theoretical concept can just alienate sometimes. Does that mean I think one should not be doing theory? Not at all. I completely love theory and the production of theory. But I also think that one needs to figure out how, what kinds of questions one is asking, what kind of theory one is producing, and theory that only applies to privileged spaces is not very useful theory for me, I guess.
So I know it's 10 to 10, but I hope you do have another 10 minutes. Would be a shame to miss out on the opportunity to have a conversation here.
It's 10 to 8.
It's not 10 to 8. Sorry. I'm confused. Yeah, 10 to 8. But we do have a bit more time, so let's give us another 10 minutes.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a question on your insurgent knowledges, and I really like the way how you still want to bring together different feminist standpoints or locations. But I'm working on indigenous women in South India, and you mentioned indigenous women and aborigines, but still I would just like you to elaborate on that. I find it so difficult to communicate with them or exchange or even get into contact with them. How would you, is it possible to get into communication with everybody, or are there certain
borders, like the epistemic framework or even the ethical framework, is so different, their fights are so different. I mean, is there still this big divide between global north or global south? How would you deal with that?
Well, I think my first question is, why are you doing the work?
Yeah, to get into communication.
You know what I mean? I mean, my first question is always, so what is it that drives us or pushes us into that context? And if the answer to that is primarily my own interest, my own this or my own that, it's going to be hard no matter what, because then you're not in a space where there is the possibility, I think, of genuine dialogue. I think anyway, dialogue is very, very difficult across radical differences anyway, I think. But I think that those people I know who have worked with indigenous communities who are non-indigenous, it's only worked because they went there because they wanted to be part of the struggle of indigenous communities. And so they went there in a space of being student versus somebody who has knowledge to impart. The moment one puts oneself in the situation of I have knowledge to impart, people are like, excuse me, I don't want to hear you. So I think that it's a lot of it, I would say, is in the approach and in the stakes one has in that work. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I say in German. My question meine Frage ist, also das, was du hier machst, das finde ich alles total richtig, nur habe ich das Gefühl, dass 80% von Leuten, die hier sitzen, mit diesem Wissen Karriere machen und dann halt mit diesem Wissen mehr Geld verdienen. Und für mich ist das halt so, dass ich das, was du sagst, auch die ganze Zeit in meinem Alltag sagen muss, damit ich weniger Gewalt ausgesetzt bin. Und ich werde aber dafür nicht entlohnt und habe existenzielle Kämpfe zu führen. Und
I have to translate first, sorry. Okay. I try to translate. So he was saying that what you're doing is really important and crucial knowledge production, and he can relate to it very much in his everyday life. But that 80% of the people sitting here building a career out of this knowledge that you're producing, while this knowledge is, for you, it's a crucial, how do you translate it? Existential mean of survival in your everyday fights.
Yeah. Thank you, I really appreciate that. That means more than somebody writing me and saying, I love your work. So, thank you. But he's not done. Okay.
He's not done. Yeah, you're not done.
Okay. Also ich würde mich jetzt eigentlich fragen, macht es Sinn, Forderungen an die Uni oder an verantwortlichen Stellen aufzustellen, dass es halt mehr People of Color Referate geben soll oder Antidiskriminierungsstellen, die halt auch von People of Color besetzt werden, damit ich für diese Arbeit, die ich sowieso tagtäglich mache, dass ich dafür entlohnt werde. Also macht es Sinn, solche Forderungen zu stellen? Oder wird Mensch da nicht nur weiter integriert in ein System durch kleine Reformen? Weil ich halt das Gefühl habe, dass sehr viele Leute existenzielle Kämpfe zu führen haben und deswegen gar nicht erst auf diese Ebene kommen, das Ganze zu essentialisieren und sich als People of Color zum Beispiel zu organisieren.
So I missed a crucial sentence in the translation before, that was that for you, the knowledge you're producing, you need this knowledge, but you don't get paid for it? Or? So, and the continuing question is, what if it makes sense to go to the university and claim the institutionalization of people of color referees or like places where you can go and complain, where people of color work, and if that is a necessary struggle, or if you don't get incorporated into the system by doing these claims. Yeah. Did I miss something?
Maybe the point.
Okay, so many people fight essential fights and they don't even get the chance to come to the point where they realize we are people of color and have to organize or think about essentialistic questions. Right. So, yeah. And, yeah.
Very well. I think he was trying to state something else. Yeah, so let me just try and help on that part of translation. Okay. So I believe the critique was that the people who are profiting from this kind of knowledge are basically already privileged in society, if I can understand that correctly, and that it's more a question of who is doing the research and are they representing themselves, or is this research being done by other people who are then profiting but actually have nothing to do with the fight personally, if I got that right. I think so. I hope so. So it was a critique, I think, now I can't translate myself. Das Weißsein, basically whiteness, yeah. So how whiteness is basically how white people represent people of color in research, and and they profit from that, whereas people of color are struggling existential fights in terms of finances and whatever, and cannot have the possibility to represent themselves. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I think my answer is, and again, I'm going to answer personally, right? I have no way of not being commodified. I can't stop my own commodification, really. Given the way the academy functions. I mean, we used to have film stars and rock stars. Well, now we have academic stars. It's very strange. But anyway, I can't prevent that, right? So, the question then I have to ask myself is, what is the work I can do that I'm good at, that I like doing, and that I think is going to be useful? I work at the university, I teach at the university, but I also work with political education outside the university, which is in many ways my way of staying honest, right? So there's, for instance, there is, in the state of Georgia in the US, there are, they've passed all kinds of rules and regulations which mean that undocumented students cannot go on to claim after graduating high school, cannot go on to university at all. They cannot go to university. Well, a group of colleagues created something called Freedom University, Georgia, which you should Google and find on the internet. And what they did is essentially offer courses for students who could not enter the university, and then make links between the students who were in their courses and their networks with faculty in other institutions. And so some of us who were in other institutions were able to mobilize to get financial aid for 3 or 4 undocumented students every year to come. Okay, so that's just an easy thing to talk about access, right? But yes, it's true that there is, we are in the space of university system where oftentimes some of us are producing knowledges and are teaching, and that isn't reaching the people we might want to reach, for instance, right? And people who are outside the institution who don't have access, sometimes don't have access to your own knowledges. I honestly believe that there's something very important about the knowledges that are produced in a university, because those knowledges are used in all kinds of governance systems across nations, contexts, and everything. So it becomes, for me, very important to find ways to intervene in the way those knowledges are produced, and to teach generations of people to, wherever they end up, to actually think in certain ways. There are other comrades that I have who think in the same ways that I do, but they're not situated at the university, and who do other kinds of political education work that I work with. And they are good at that, and they do that. But I have privilege that I need to mobilize. And this is how I mobilize my privilege, right? So I'm here, I have all of you as captive audience, right? So I get to say what I want to say. And maybe I get to say things that people here might have some difficulty saying for fear of penalty of some kind. So I think, I have never felt guilty about my privileges. I have always tried to be conscious of them and to utilize them in ways that would provide certain kinds of access, certain kinds of reformulations, and so on. I don't know if I answered your question at all. I mean, people are always going to profit. Do you know what I mean? I can't change white people unless they want to be anti-racist. And then I work with them. So, again, I don't want to do an us and them either in here, right? But sometimes it ends up being like that, but that's not useful.
Right now it's 8:05. And I think maybe we should now collect a round of questions to finish up. And Vanessa, you had one?
I also wanted to pose a question. Thank you so much for this really important talk, and especially for highlighting and emphasizing also the local struggles here, because many of us, and I include myself, often experience in a sort of way that, critical, transnational, post-colonial feminists come from elsewhere to talk about racism over there, and intersectional power relations over there. And I think it's, thank you very much actually for emphasizing also the struggles here, and then for engaging in conversation with us on these struggles. My question, or it's more, it's a question and a remark at the same time, because I very much appreciate your notion of saying, okay, why do we do the work? So the question of, like, what is our intention? And also the emphasis on working with social movements. At the same time, I'm a bit hesitant concerning this, and I work with the black social movements in France myself, with a black activist group from a decolonial ethics perspective, which has very much to do with accountability. But I think when you said, okay, why do we do this work? I think it's also, especially when we work with social movements, really important to ask, how do we do this work? And I would like you to maybe also explore on the notion of, or on the importance of accountability more, because I think that especially like we have learned from indigenous communities, how much in a sort of way a researcher who says, oh well, yes, I work with you, can be a danger afterwards if the process is not negotiated in a decolonial ethical way. And this sometimes starts with our research questions, right. That the questions we pose are maybe not the questions which are of importance of the social movements we work with. Sure. So I would really, because this also happened in the German context already, students and researchers working with the initiative of remembrance of Uri Jallo, for example,
working with them, and at the same time afterwards very much capitalizing on their work. And there was a very strong critique also from this initiative. So I wanted to ask you if you could explore more on responsibility and accountability within this work.
Yeah. So just very quickly, because it is 8:05. So I think absolutely it is true that it's not just why one is doing the work, but how one does the work. And the how of the work, I think, has to do with if you seriously believe that you are doing this work in order to be a part of a particular social movement for justice, then there needs to be some deep thought about what it means to be in partnership with people, first of all. And two, there needs to be some very clear transparency and understanding about coming up with the research questions collaboratively and being very clear about where the knowledge produced goes and who gets credited for those. So those are just a few things. And I actually know people who've done this in an incredible way. I also know that most of the time it's the opposite. That we work, oftentimes people from the academy work with social movements and they become, career steps, basically. And that's part of, I think that's part of a colonial mentality that has to really be challenged. So, is that enough? Yeah. Okay, thanks.
So, final round of questions? No more.
No final question. No. That was the final question.
That was the final question.
Okay. All right.
Let's give a big cheer to Chandra.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
I just said, I wish you well in your struggles. A luta continua, right? Be strong.